I'm not someone that holds on to nostalgia with their dear life like many in the movie fan base, but I do have some childhood favorites that still hold up today. Now I know everyone has their opinions on what the best movies were from our childhoods, but I have a list of movies that I can still appreciate to this day and not cringe at because, believe me, there's quite a few that are cringeworthy. So I did a top 8 instead of a top 10, and I know most people usually do a top 10 list, but I didn't want to throw any filler movies into the list. I really wanted to highlight the movies that really stood out to me as a kid. So without further ado, here's what I consider the best childhood movies of the 2000s. Number 8, B-Movie. Okay, maybe I cringe at this one a little bit, but for good reasons. This movie is one of the weirdest things to ever be created, and I say that as a good thing. I'm convinced this was written as a weird animated movie for adults, but the studio didn't let that slide, so they rewrote it for kids, and here we are with one of the weirdest kids movies of all time, and it's actually pretty funny.
Watch this!
At this point in time, this movie has a cult following behind it. Some people have gone as far to get the whole script on their shirt because of how weird this movie is. There's a joke about suicide, a jab at Winnie the Pooh, a joke about drag queens, race, and the weirdest thing is the relationship between this lady and a bee that's voiced by Jerry Seinfeld of all people. There's also a lot of hidden dirty jokes and just insane things that happen. I will say that this movie is entertaining because of its clever sense of humor. It's a little cheesy, but you know, it's a kid's movie. I would probably show it to my children one day and see how many jokes go over their head. Number 7, The Incredibles. I know a lot of people would probably rank this one higher in their list, but for me it's number 7, which is still really good. Pixar was in its prime during this time period, and comic book movies were on the rise, so I think it was a no-brainer that this movie would be successful. I think it shines in its humor, and it also tells a great story with serious undertones. I'd say it actually gets kind of dark when you really think about it. I mean, superheroes are being murdered, and a dude attempts to commit suicide. In a kid's movie. But there's also a baby with superpowers, so yeah, I guess it is still a kid's movie. It's also another movie with subtle adult humor that completely went over my head as a kid, which really makes me appreciate this movie more today. Now I could see how this movie might have too much action compared to other Pixar movies, which isn't for everyone, but it has an excellent sense of humor with some iconic lines and a dark tone that you wouldn't get from many kids movies, let alone Disney. Number 6, RV. I guess you could throw this one into family movie category rather than just kids movies, but this one was a big part of my childhood, so I had to put it in the list. I think this is one of the most underrated movies of not only the 2000s, but of Robin Williams' career. For some reason it got bad reviews at the time, but I don't really understand the hate. The jokes are honestly very relatable for a lot of families, and there's a lot of dialogue in here that never fails. Now, if you have a sensitive stomach, I can see how one scene would not sit right with you, and that's completely understandable. But regardless of that, the movie actually has a well-written story with a lot of meaning behind it, and it's fun, and it has a great sense of humor. I'd almost say it's like a PG version of We're the Millers in a sense. I'm not usually the biggest fan of dumb road trip movies, but this one is the exception. If you haven't seen RV, I recommend you watch it. It may not be the funniest thing to you because it is a family movie, but I enjoyed it, and I think I could still laugh at it today. Number 5, Shrek. So you're probably wondering, why is the greatest movie of all time not at number 1? Well, it just didn't seem fair to rank this movie at number 1 based on Shrek's sexiness alone, so I had to be reasonable. There is a huge obsession with this character, and the amount of memes around it is just insane. I think this has become the most memeable movie in existence. It's at the point where you can't hear Smash Mouth without thinking of Shrek. Now, while this movie has become a giant meme, it has some qualities that really make it hold up well today. For one thing, I definitely don't think this movie was originally made for kids. Even more so than B-movie, the boner scene is enough evidence of that. The Shrek movies probably have the most sexual jokes of any kids movies in existence, and it's kind of awkward. And they all went over my head growing up. But underneath all that, the movie actually has a meaningful story about a monster that's misunderstood. Someone that wants to be alone, but at the same time is secretly lonely. Anyway, that's enough Shrek talk. On to the next movie. Shrek 2. This one is just too damn good. I think somehow it's funnier today than I thought it was as a child, because this movie takes it too far to be a kid's movie.
Catnip.
That's no mine.
Police brutality! Police brutality!
This shit would not slide for a second today. But I think Shrek 2 does a really good job of staying interesting because of the world building and the ridiculous amount of things it parodies. Our main characters go to a place that is basically just a fairy tale version of Los Angeles. At the end of the day though, the movie is still another buddy road trip like the first one, but with new characters and even dirtier jokes somehow for a kids movie. I think the finale is also far more grand than the first in terms of its action and scale. I could do without the musical numbers, but that's just me. Solid movie, highly recommend you watch it after a couple drinks. Number 3 is Surf's Up. To me, this is one of the most underrated movies that came out during my childhood, and I don't think it gets the recognition it deserves. It was probably the first animated movie to take a documentary-style approach. It's really the last thing you would expect from a kids movie because we all know kids love documentaries. Shia LaBeouf basically plays the kind of character he played a lot during the 2000s, and I think that's okay because it brings in a very different personality that you don't normally see in an animated movie like this. It's very much an underdog story about a kid chasing his dream only to find out that the trophies never really mattered. I won't get into too much detail because if you haven't seen this one, I highly recommend it. It's a great concept and I think the story and humor really hold up. It also has, hands down, the best soundtrack of any kids movie of the 2000s. Seriously, follow my beach playlist, it has a lot of songs from this movie. And for the next movie, Nacho Libre. This was a tough one, because I really couldn't decide if I wanted this to be my number 1 or number 2 on this list. Either way, it certainly deserved to be in my top 3. Nacho Libre is probably one of the funniest kids movies to ever exist, and I think that's because of its dumb sense of humor and extreme awkwardness that just makes it hilarious every time I rewatch it. I'd say it's actually funnier today than when I watched it as a kid because the movie is filled with subtle adult jokes that were perfectly written. I'd maybe even put this in my list of favorite comedies. I get how this one may not be for everyone because it's filled with fart noises and fat jokes, but the comedic timing is everything. Not only that, but there is an inspirational story hidden in here about a guy going against his religion so he can fulfill his dream and help the people he cares about. Granted, it's still a Jack Black movie, but I don't think anyone else could have played this character. It was practically written for him. One thing that this movie has against all the other movies on this list is the cinematography. It surprisingly has some great shots that really show the director's art style, and I never really got any of that from a lot of the movies from my childhood, so I think that really makes it stand out. So yeah, Nacho Libre's fucking amazing. Number 1, The Iron Giant. This is hands down one of the greatest animated movies of all time. Brad Bird has directed many Pixar movies, including The Incredibles, but this is hands down his best work. It tackles the theme of what if a gun had a soul, which is pretty heavy for a kids movie. To me, it feels like a classic Spielberg type movie, but in animated form, which seems like a tough act to pull off. The tonal shift is also much darker than you expect from a kids movie. With the destructive military action and the way some characters take things way too far, you'd really think that this movie would be PG-13, but at the end of the day, it's still a kids movie. Its sense of humor and charm are what make this movie so entertaining and really make it feel like a kids movie. I remember this being the first movie I ever loved. Every week, I would pop this one in the VHS player and watch it in awe. It was one of the first movies to make me truly feel something. I often wonder if this is one of the movies that led me to my passion for filmmaking and watching movies today. I'm not gonna say it's the greatest movie of all time, but I love knowing that this was the first movie I ever truly appreciated. I must admit I was a little scared to watch it today with my views on movies now, because oftentimes you go back and watch a movie from your childhood and it's not as good as you remember, but somehow my perspective never changed.